An unreached people group is a group of people among whom there is little to no access to the gospel. Now, I want to unpack that just a little bit. So first, a people group. So when we look in the Bible and we see Jesus command us to make disciples of all nations, when he says nations there, he's not talking about nations like we think of nations today, like geopolitical entities around 200 or so united nations. He's talking about ethnic groups. That's actually the word there in Matthew 28:19, ethne. And it's a word we see in different points throughout the New Testament, as well as pictures in the Old Testament. So think Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, Hivites. So think people that share a common language, cultural characteristics that comprise an ethnicity. And so you look at different nations in the world, geopolitical entities, and there's all kinds of different people groups in nations. I mean, not just in nations, in a global city. Like I live in greater Washington, D.C. There are so many different people groups that are represented around me. And so all around the world, depending on how you identify kind of the lines between people groups, there's at least 11,000, if not over 16,000 different people groups. And so think about the world like that, and then think about unreached. So an unreached people group is a people group that has little to no access to the gospel. So that is different than just being lost. So lost and unreached are not the same thing. To be lost, I mean, that's the same whether you are in Washington, D.C., or you are in the middle of Saudi Arabia. If you're apart from God in your sin and you've not placed your faith in Christ, you are lost. The difference between most parts of Washington, D.C. and Saudi Arabia is that there is access to the gospel in Washington, D.C. There are many Christians in Washington, D.C. There are many gospel-preaching churches in Washington, D.C. And in the middle of Saudi Arabia, there are very few Christians, very few gospel-preaching churches, and therefore there's little access to the gospel. What that means practically is, if you're in an unreached people group, there's a good likelihood that you will be born, you will live, and you will die without ever even hearing the gospel. Like, you won't meet a Christian who knows the gospel and is able to share it with you. You won't hear the gospel preached by a church. You'll be born, live, and die with little to no knowledge of the gospel. Think Romans chapter 15, when Paul talks about people or places where the name of Christ is not known. That is an unreached people group. And today, out of the 11 or 16 or thousand so people groups in the world, 6,000 to 7,000 of them are still unreached, comprising well over 2 billion people. Some numbers put it over 3, but we'll say at least 2 billion people in the world right now are a part of a people group where there is little to no access to the gospel. Unreached people groups are a serious reality today. I would actually say it's the most serious justice issue in the world today, that there are this many people who are on a road in sin that leads to an eternity separated from God, and they have never even heard the good news of how Jesus can save them from their sin.